Hi, welcome to my channel Cloud with Girish. In the previous video workshop, I demonstrated how to secure your CloudFront distribution or website using AWS WAF. I also covered sending custom response code and messages using AWS WAF, as well as rate limiting an API endpoint. Additionally, I provided a tutorial on rate limiting with the URI path as a scope down statement for more fine-grained rule control. Lastly, I explained how to implement IP whitelisting with AWS WAF. If you missed it, be sure to check out the tutorial linked in the description before continuing. In this video, I will demonstrate another use case, implementing IP whitelisting using AWS WAF and creating a rule with a scope down statement for a URI path condition. With this approach, only the IP addresses listed in the AWS WAF IP set will have access to resources such as API endpoint. The rule will be applied only if the specified resource path is included in the URI. If the API endpoint is accessed from an IP not listed in the IP set, or if the designated resource path is not present in the URI, a 403 forbidden response will be returned, denying access to the endpoint. Let's look at our business use case. We need to implement IP whitelisting using AWS WAF and also apply a scope down statement to add a rule to check URI path. So we'll create an IP set, we'll create a rule that uses this IP set to determine if access to the API endpoint should be guaranteed. Also validate URI path for the allowed resource path. If rule is triggered, return 403 forbidden response. I will be creating the AWS WAF, WebACL and rules using AWS console. However, you can create the AWS WAF rule using CloudFormation as well. Also for the URI path condition, I'm using a contact API and I'm gonna use the URI create contact, which is for the post method, as a condition along with the IP set to block the access for the post method, but at the same time all the get should not be impacted by this rule. Let's look at our architecture. We have the consumer who wants to access the contact API through the API gateway. It's hosted via API gateway. It's integrated with a Lambda function. Lambda function is getting the data from a DynamoDB and also creating the data in the DynamoDB if there is a post request for the create contact. We are putting a WAF in front of the API gateway and we are creating the IP set as well as the rule with the URI path condition. And if the rule gets triggered, then a 403 forbidden IP message will be provided back to the user. For the prereq, like I stated earlier, there are other workshops on the AWS WAF topic and link to these workshop is in the description. So please check this out. Let's get started. We're going to review the AWS WAF service. We will look at the key resources to protect, the core component, the example use cases, configuring the WebACL. We'll create an IP set with the list of IP to be whitelisted, setting up rules that uses this IP set, and then also add a scope down statement for URI path. I'll associate this with the AWS resource, which in this use case is the AWS API gateway. And then I will validate the solution by accessing the API endpoint using the postman. Once WAF rule trigger, access will only be allowed if it is from the whitelisted IP or if the rule is not triggered. Then we're going to look at the resource cleanup, which is like removing the association and deleting the rules, deleting the WebACL and so on. So let's look at the WAF service. AWS WAF is a fully managed web application firewall service provided by AWS. It simplifies the process of protecting the web resources by allowing you to define web ACL, the access control list, and custom rules, or by using pre-configured rule from the AWS marketplace. Once set up, AWS WAF safeguard your web application based on the specified rule. The key component of WAF are web ACL, rules, and rules group. Now, multiple rules can be applied and the priority of those rules can be adjusted if you have multiple rules. Rule action can be allow, block, count, and few others. Rule group is a collection of rules. We can build our own rule group or we can buy pre-built rule group from Amazon Marketplace. Now, of course, if we're buying pre-built group, there is a cost associated with that. Nothing is free. So in this case, assess for your use case, benefit, and pricing. These are the services which are supported by AWS WAF at the time of creating this video in October of 2024. So CloudFront, API Gateway, Application Load Balancer, Cognito User Pool, AppSync, and App Runner are the services which are supported by AWS WAF. As you can see in this diagram, there are various use cases that we can fulfill by attaching AWS WAF with any of these supported resources. So let's talk about a few of the use cases that we can support by using the AWS WAF. So some of the use cases are, one popular one is the protect from DDoS attack at a layer 7 level. There is another service that AWS provides, the AWS Shield Advanced, and that is used for DDoS protection at layer 3. Implement geo restriction. We can build rule around implementing IP restriction, implement the rate limit for API or any other resource for that matter, protection from SQL injection, and several other use cases. Since we're talking about layer 7 and layer 3, I thought that I provide a quick review of OSI layer that I'm sure that if you are in computer engineering field, you probably remember the OSI layer from your engineering classes. There are 7 layers starting from physical layer all the way to application layer. So layer 3 is the network layer, and that's where in the previous slide I was showing that another AWS service, that AWS Shield Advanced, that provides protection at a network layer level. The AWS WAF, which we are using in this example, provide the protection at a application layer. Let's also look at like URI path, just so we clear that what exactly URI means. The URI path is a part of web address called a URI or URL that points to a specific resource or page on a server. So it comes right after the domain name and tells the server what information or resources you are trying to access. Typically, there are 4 parts of the URI. So it looks like a scheme, authority, path, query. An example URL path is that you have the scheme, which is in this case HTTPS API-endpoint.com, which could be whatever domain or API address that we are providing, / the resource path. So that's like dev / create contact. And if there is a get related request, then of course there can be an optional parameter for query where we provide the query string. So that's a typical URI path. I wanted to show an example of it. So now let's configure the IP set. I'm gonna name the IP set as allowed IP contact API, and then I can put a description which is optional, picking the region as US East Ohio, and then I'm gonna pick a IP version IPv4. Once my IP set is created, next I will configure the web ACL and the rule for our use case. So let's click on create WebACL from the WAF service area. I have two resources type to pick from. Either I can have a CloudFront distribution, or I can have other resources like load balancer, API gateway, app runner, and other services. So in this example, I will be eventually picking the API gateway. So I'm picking the regional resource from this option. Region is Ohio, US East, and then I'm going to name it as a Contact API WebACL. I'm going to provide a description, which is optional, and also a name for the CloudWatch metric. Next, let's create the rule. I can have, I'm not using a manage rule for this use case, hence I will select add my own rules and rule group from the dropdown. AWS provide the option like to pick from the manage rule group, but in this case, I'm creating my own rule. So let's provide a rule name and select the rule type as a regular rule. So again, I'm going to name it create contact API rule, just to align with my use case, and I'm picking a regular rule. You can use Visual Editor to build a rule, or can use JSON to build a rule in JSON format. For this session, I'm going to use Visual Editor. We'll continue to build the rule, and we'll select the rule condition, select the IP set created in the previous statement. So I'm building my rule here, and I'm saying, hey, select this IP set, which I created in the previous step. And then we'll continue to build the rule because we need to apply a scope down statement. So here I'm saying, hey, the URI path, if it contains a string of create contact, then basically that will be like another condition for my rule. And if this rule get triggered, then I'm saying block the action for that for the use case. Now, when you create the rule and rule group, pay attention to WCU. These are maximum allowed unit are 5,000. These stand for WebACL capacity unit. It's a measurement unit. So like in this example for this rule, it's telling me that I'm consuming 12 WCU out of 5,000 allocated for my account. Next, let's select an action for scenario when requests don't match any configure rule. So this is a overarching rule, and I'm going to say, hey, allow the request if it doesn't trigger my rule here. If I have multiple rules, I can define the priority for those rules, but in this case, I only have one rule, so that doesn't apply. So in the next few steps, we'll configure the CloudWatch metrics and request sampling. And then once rule is fully configured, it's ready to be created. I'll see a screen which show me all the configuration that I have selected, and then I can create it, and then WebACL is now created and is ready for use. Now I have my rule and the WebACL. I need to associate with a resource. So I'm going to associate this with a REST API. So I'm going to select the Amazon API gateway. I'm going to see the API endpoint available. I'm selecting the contact API from this for my use case. And then I'm just simply going to add the association. Once I have all this set up in place, so I have my WebACL, the rule, the IP set, the association with the API gateway. Now the next step is to validate that if it is working per the use case. So now I have an API endpoint, which is create contact. So it's basically like a post request to create new contact in the DynamoDB via Lambda, which is getting invoked through the API endpoint. So if you see here, because I said, hey, if the string matches create contact, then make it part of the rule. So this is exactly what's happening here, that is checking for the IP and the URI, and if that condition meet and rule is getting triggered, and that's why in the response I'm getting 403 forbidden. And this is precisely the use case that I wanted to implement. So this is how like WAF rule with multiple condition, like I'm checking for the IP, I'm checking for the URI path, and then I'm triggering the rule here, right? All of that can be accomplished. Let's look at this another scenario where we do expect API to return a response. That means my WAF rule will not be triggered, so I should be able to get the response back. So here in this scenario now, I have switched my API endpoint to a GET request, and I'm saying, hey, give me my contacts from my database. So here I'm getting the response back. Again, same setup, the data is in the DynamoDB. I'm invoking the Lambda function through this API, which is hosted in the API gateway. I'm using Postman to invoke the API, and then I'm getting the response being returned as expected. So this is how we wanted to implement this use case, and this is working as expected. So now if I don't need to keep this rule, then I should go ahead and clean up the resources so that like I don't incur the charges in the AWS account. So step 2 that is that remove any association, be it with CloudFront or API gateway or any other resource that rule is associated. Then delete the rule, delete the ACL, and then delete the IP set. So that way you will ensure that they are not sitting idle in the account and not incurring the cloud cost in the account. So in this workshop, we successfully demonstrated how to implement IP whitelisting using AWS WAF. We also implemented a rule that utilizes the URI path to further determine whether access to the resources should be guaranteed. IP whitelisting is a fundamental security measure used by enterprises to protect resources, and it can be effectively combined with other rules to create a multi-layered security approach. Hope you enjoy this tutorial. I'm constantly working on new content covering various AWS topics, so please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Cloud with Girish channel. Your support helps me continue creating valuable AWS tutorials and workshops. Stay tuned for more exciting content. Thanks for watching.